Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to our coaching conversations webinars series that we're going to do for 2023. We've had a little break due to our busy work schedules, but we've also been thinking about some interesting topics that we've kind of come across as in our work around the world as coaching consultants. So today we've chosen the topic of improving tennis skills in squad lessons or group lessons, because we know that as coaches, it can be perhaps somewhat more challenging to improve players when we have lots of children on the court. So we're really going to focus on that age group of kind of 10 and under, 12 and under, 14 under, competitive players, people that are coming regularly to your coaching sessions, and then really discussing and flirting with the idea of how can we maximize their development without automatically forcing them or putting them down the road of doing individual lessons in order to improve players faster. We know individual lessons are also an important part of developing as a player, but we also know that most tennis players, in fact, I would say all tennis players, at some stage in their development, were experiencing group lessons where they're playing with other players of the same level, or slightly higher or slightly lower level. So that's the main theme we're going to talk about. I want to welcome back Frank and Avoye into this conversation. Avoye, I'm going to pass it over to you first. What do you think about the topic of coaching players and improving players in group sessions?
I think it's a very interesting topic. And first of all, I would like to say that when we are talking from my side, I can add one understanding that it's a big difference when we talk about European region in developing young competitive players in the Western countries, where still we have I would call it a standard club structure with the clubs, with different teams, and where the team competitions are very emphasized as a part of the club life. Compared to the Eastern Europe, where most of the clubs are not really clubs in the Western type of understanding. It's more like facilities that can be run by different coaches. And the consequence is that it's not structured. It's not a structure inside these facilities as a club, but it's more like coaches that are running their own private programs with different players. And I believe you are aware that it's much more like an individual practice in Eastern Europe, and perhaps in twos, in very small groups. So I would say that's a very important thing to consider now at the beginning of our conversation.
Yeah, great point. Great point. It can very differ culturally. Frank, do you want to open up with what you think some of the challenges are and your take on coaching players in groups?
Yeah, next to what Avoye just mentioned, that there are cultural differences related to whether it's Western Europe or other parts of the world. I think it's important that in group sessions, they need the goal setting to know where you're going. What I see a lot is that actually in group sessions, it's everyone doing the same. And it's some of the coaches, they decide stepping on court what they're going to do. So that doesn't look like planning. And as we all know, if you don't know where you're going, then you shouldn't be surprised to find yourself at a strange place after that. So goal setting is important. And one of the things is that we have to differentiate between general development, let's say roughly under 14, and specific development later on when it's related to game type. So it's important to make sure that under 14, under 12, that you teach them many different skills and you try to make them as skilled as possible, develop all the techniques. Later on, you will start to specialize. And that means the specific goal setting per player will become more and more important. Now, when the player knows what he is trying to aim for, then he can also do that in a group session. So for me, it's not a must to have individual sessions to work on your technique or to work on decisions. You can also do that in group sessions. It's more complicated. You have to differentiate more because maybe one is a baseliner, the other one is a net rusher, and you want to make sure that they pick the necessary skills and also the decisions they take, etc. But it's especially important to have these goals set per player and they know what they're doing.
If I can just jump in on a practical example that I use in my training of coaches or of players is this concept of plan the situation. You talked about planning goals for the group, but then to have individual goals within that. And so let's take an example of like the return of second serve. I want to do a squad this evening with my under 14 players on the return of second serve.
Yeah.
But how we then chunk that up during the session could be different. So maybe player one, you're going to return second serve by stepping in, taking the ball early, like Murray would do. But player two, you're going to be Rafa. You're going to back up, run around the backhand, and play a heavy moon ball down the line. Player three, you're going to change the rhythm of the serve, but like Dan Evans, and play more of a slice. And then player four, maybe you just stay there, hold your position, play deep cross court. So everyone can do something different that's linked more to the way they are more likely to play the game, the way they're more likely to return serve. Of course, you could get everyone to be exposed to every skill, but then as the term goes on, or as their game style becomes more clearly defined, they then choose the one that's more appropriate for their game. So you can definitely, in a group situation, plan the theme, but individual is the response. And I think that works as a practical example to the points you were just making.
Yeah, excellent example. And so important for players to know that within a certain topic, like return of serve or going to the net, that you can differentiate to the specific demands for that player. And going to the net is so interesting when you think of the old-fashioned matches between Federer and Nadal. Nadal would go to the net 12 times, win the point 11 times.
Yeah.
And Federer would go to the net 32 times and winning the points only 20 times.
Yeah.
So then people would say, oh, Nadal should go to the net. He's a real net rusher.
Yeah.
No way. He knows when he's going, and it's almost sure to win the point. And Federer is more adventurous. You can also see this kind of preferences with your players in groups. So I like your example you just gave, because that's specific, that they know what they're working at. And you can do that also in a group session. But you don't see that too often, unfortunately.
No.
May I jump in here? And I would like to share with our audience also one resource that I believe is a very good one to visit, and also related to the topic that we talk about. It's the Ace Coach website from Tennis Canada.
Yep.
Where actually Wayne Elderton was just finishing one series of the articles talking about different ways to work with the players. But interesting, what he also was preparing is a session structure, a different session structure for the group practices. And now when we are talking about adapting and developing, for example, technique, that always is a challenge in a group setting, to look at the part of the practice that he calls a fundamental volume training. I believe this is a very good idea, especially at the beginning of the session, to focus on practicing and repeating some fundamental technical skills that we can also then differentiate between the different players. Yeah. And what I found very interesting is that he puts it immediately in a tactical context. That is a modern way of thinking. So that would be one thing from my side to share with our audience, and to really visit Ace Coach website and look at this session structure that I find it's very interesting and very well, presented.
So on that topic then, Voye, let's talk, because there'll be parents that are listening to this webinar that might think, well, surely having one-to-ones is better than being in a group with other children, because the coach will give their attention 100% of the time to one pupil. So I can afford it. I've got money. I just want my children to have private lessons because they'll get better value for money. They'll learn faster and improve quicker. That is a rational thought that some parents could have, for sure. So let's talk about the benefits of group lessons. So the one example you just gave then is that there's no shortcuts to this journey. You need to hit a lot of balls. So the fundamental volume training, repetition of the basics of the cross courts, of the down the lines, of volleys, serves, doing that lends itself very nicely in a group situation, because the children can hit with other players and they can experience just hitting lots of balls. That's a huge benefit to doing group lessons. But what are some of the other benefits that would maybe convince a parent that, yeah, actually group lessons, squad lessons are a really valuable tool for player development?
I can give you now one example. Sorry, Frank, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's very interesting because my son also is now 12. He is practicing. He's I would say, exactly the player that we are talking about. And yesterday he played one tournament, and on his way back in the car, he asked me, "Father, but I would like to actually practice once in a group lesson. During the week, he's going for 3 group lessons in a week, but one with my old friends. Actually, he now became a bit better than these other friends of him. But he said, I would like to be with them at least once per week." Mm-hmm. And he said some very smart thing in addition. One thing, obviously, what you said, or what you asked before, what are the benefits? Of course, you have to be in an environment that you enjoy as a player to stay. Yeah. So he wants to feel that he's with his friends, because he was put in a bit older group and practicing twice per week in the morning with girls that are 15. So it's very different mindset up, obviously. What is good for him in one way, but he feels that he needs also his own environment. So I would say that's very important benefit of the group lesson. You cannot just take your player out of his natural environment. But the other thing he also said, and I was really surprised, when he said, but also if I'm always playing with the better ones, I cannot try the things in a way when I'm also playing with the bit weaker players. And very often, and I was surprised because I didn't tell him this, because very often the parents are thinking only practicing with better players will make you better. But that's in a way opposite, because very often if you're playing with the older ones, like he is now playing, the balls are coming to you actually always faster than it's your, let's say, real standard at the moment. Yeah. So you're more under defense. Instead of developing offensive game, you will more develop defensive game. Instead of actually putting the other under pressure and developing your creative thinking, it's more like survival. Of course, it's good to have a combination, and I think that's a great advantage of having group practices. And if you mix also the levels, that's fantastic.
Just on that, I've got a great video that I took of Coco Gauff's father at Le Petit Art in Tarbes when she was 11 years of age, or 12. I think she was 11 or 12 years of age, playing at least a year young. And she lost in the final that day. And I asked the father, does she play up? Or does she play down? Does she play at the same level? She said, no, she will. He answered it quite clearly. He said she competes up and competes down. She had a very individualized program, actually. She did play at the academy, one of the academies in Florida a little bit, and certainly at Moritoglu she would have done. So she would hit with other children. But the reality is, she said, I always wanted to compete up and compete down for exactly the same reasons, that she's not always swimming in the deep end, that she's not always scrambling around the baseline learning to hustle, but that she can be creative with the point and she can work the ball around the courts. So that point of playing up and down, training up and down, but also competing up and down, I think really, really important for parents and for coaches to give us messages to parents as well. Frank, anything that you also think is a real good benefit of doing group lessons?
Yeah, I'd like to add something there. There are two things. The examples you gave, Simon, about some of the top players and the way they return. One of the good things in a group session is that you can tell one player to step in, take the ball early, and give pressure, the other one to block it and just play it deep. And by giving these individual examples, they also hear that there are different options and that they will respect different ways of playing. Also knowing that when you have an opponent who does this or that, they can adapt to it. So it's, let's say, it makes them understand the different ways to play the game and maybe even how to handle it. The other thing I like in group sessions is to ask players to talk about each other and ask them, who do you think has the fastest forehand here? Who's the one who runs down all the drop shot? Which one do you think is the quickest in running down a drop shot and then winning the point? Yeah. And as we all know from psychology, the peer opinion is so important, because you as a coach or the parents, for them it's like, well, that's kind of distant, those are adults and okay, I believe them. But when their peers talk about them like, wow, your heavy topspin forehand is such a nasty shot to play, that makes them grow. It really is interesting to see how children can reinforce some of the qualities, and they will really appreciate that. So for all kinds of understanding the game, getting confidence, I also think it's really an important thing to have this.
I agree with that. I've witnessed that a lot it's obvious, it's maths, right? It's just simple maths. If you're in a group session of 4 players, 6 players, 8 players, the coach can't give you feedback on every repetition, on every single thing that goes right and goes wrong, which does happen a lot in individual lessons because it's a one-on-one relationship. So there's a learning overload often in private lessons because the coach feels like, well, they're paying me for a one-on-one lesson that's 4 times more expensive than the group lesson. I better give them value for money. I better be seen to be talking because the parents are watching. So there's a lot of communication, and often for good reasons and often for not. There's often an overemphasis of talking, but in group lessons, it's about, like you said, it's about hitting balls. And it's about learning to play the game, and it's about playing against different types of opponents. It's about playing with freedom without the coach on your shoulders saying things all the time, which is such an important part of the era that we grew up, which I don't think is going to come back anytime soon, but did have some benefits, which there was less coaching available, and therefore people played more with their friends at clubs, and they just sparred in the boxing ring. It was free play, as we call it here in the UK. But free play is more rare now. Children are organized and scheduled to death. Monday is swimming, and Tuesday is cricket, and Wednesday is rugby, and Thursday is violin practice, and Friday is tennis. So children are going from activity to activity, driven by their parents, and they have a tight schedule, which means they have less time for this free. I don't say every country is the same, but that's certainly something that's true here in the UK. And therefore, how do we replicate that good old-fashioned just playing the game freely without having to think too much about what the coach is always saying in my ear? And I think group coaching does offer a nice replacement for that. So there's just so many benefits from experiencing group coaching, technically, tactically, learning-wise, teaching-wise, playing the game, but also that you're right, being with other people with similar, not just the same age, not just your friendship groups, but with the same mindset, being the best player they can become. Being in that group, I think is motivating.
I'd like to add one thing that may be very logical to us, but it doesn't count for the group sessions where they still have 8 players in a line, the coach feeding one ball. And, that is how I was taught when I was a young player.
Yeah.
And after 10 lessons, 6 of the players dropped out because they didn't improve at all. So it's, of course, where we talk about all players being active, all players hitting balls, so that you have this high number of balls to get experience, to have learning possibilities. So it's, maybe an open door to just make this statement. But I think for those people in the world who are not familiar with that, we are not talking about the coach feeding one ball to one player, 7 doing nothing, and then the next one comes and you shout just one correction and the other one, and that's not a learning situation. So that's essential.
Maximum volume, maximum participation. Voye.
Frank, actually, you have just tackled one very interesting point, and reasoning why the parents and coaches are also emphasizing the need for individual lessons. One is actually to have enough repetitions in a lesson, and you also gave now also the reason, the way how to avoid this trap. But there are 2 other, I would call it, strong arguments in Eastern Europe to do it, and I would like you to give the solution how to actually give it also through the group lessons from your side. So from the parents also, I hear it very often. Yeah, also my player is not getting the ball he needs in order to develop. And second, actually the player doesn't have enough space because he's only half of the court. And even now, the third one is coming to my mind. Did you remember the first 2? So the third one is actually the coach is not giving feedback enough to my player. Mm-hmm. So what you would say to these parents in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, especially on that third one, I wanted to mention that just as a small sidestep, I remember I was talking to a person who is in an organization for physiotherapists. And what this guy admitted to me is, he said, the number one healing factor is that the physiotherapist gives 100% attention to the patient, or well, to the person who was there. And what you see on court is that it's not about the quality of the correction, but a lot of people would be impressed by the fact that you as a coach are just talking to my son. And so I see he gets all the attention. Even if you would talk BS, it would still be great because I see that you give him all attention. And of course, my son, is quite stupid because you told him already and you keep telling him, so you are a great coach. And that has nothing to do with effective learning. It's actually giving a lot of attention that people feel for. And I also have experience in a country where I was working with players. I didn't say much, but I gave them a task. They did it well. You saw them improve. But because I didn't tell them exactly how to do it, they thought that I did not work technically with them. And you saw them with their adapted technique really being more effective. So it's very often the expectation of 100% attention for one person, and you just bury them with all the corrections. That seems like, oh, there's so much to learn here. And again, it's not effective learning. It's just a lot of attention going to one person, and that gives a great feeling for the parents. And when you ask players, very often they can't even remember which corrections were effective and which ones weren't.
Voye, I'll just add onto the third point there that Frank's talking about the constant feedback that the parents or the players are expecting, perhaps, or are perceiving what they should be receiving in group lessons. Well, one thing I would say is the parent could be right. There are many coaches, group coaches, that don't say anything, don't give feedback. They just set up drills. They just do activities, and I would, and perhaps the lesson demands that. Perhaps it's about autonomous learning. It's about self-discovery, and that's fine. And if we educate parents on, we're going to approach lessons in different ways, and sometimes we're going to say very little. We want the parent to think deeply about how they're going to improve. Then I think parents would mostly be on board with that. However, there are definitely experiences where the coaches are seeing the group lessons as just a drilling session, and therefore perhaps are not feeding back, and they think their job is to motivate through the task. And that could be right, could be wrong. Now, what I would say on that is that when we do give feedback, we can do it outwardly looking in. So that's the coach roaming the courts, the American college coach setting the environment, giving motivating feedback, creating the culture, creating a high performance environment. And that's generic feedback. And then the responsibility is, of course, of the player to listen to that and to change or improve or develop or maintain. Now, there are some times where the coach has to coach individually within the group sessions. And that might be pulling someone out, having a quick conversation, or it might be just whispering, in the ear, so to speak, of that one individual person, because they only really, and look, we've all done that. We've had a group coaching where one player is not giving 100% effort, for example. Well, we don't punish the whole group because one person is not doing a split step, or they're not moving their feet, or letting the ball bounce twice. We just, hey, Joe, everything okay? Okay, good. Chase every ball, buddy. Come on, effort. Keep giving you effort, unconditional effort, all the way to the end. Let's go. And we coach that person individually. But not everybody needs feedback on every skill. So that's what I would say to that parent. But I would also acknowledge that the parent could be right, that there may be situations where they've not experienced great group coaching. I think what's interesting is that the Spanish Academy, South American academies, even Bollettieri, they found a solution to that, and that was the coach always feeding. So if the coach is always feeding, like if you go to a Sanchez Cascal, there is a coach in the middle, basket feeding a lot, or hand feeding. So they're always doing something, even if it's, but often the teaching is quite generic, actually. It's vamos, up to the ball, up, get back. It's almost instructions of what to do, of the drill, rather than how to improve the skill. That's a real mirage of of coaching effectiveness, I would say. Just telling them how to do the drill, not what they should do to do the drill better, is not coaching, in my opinion. It's just setting up the drill. So that's just a couple of things on that, on your third point I wanted to add on to Frank's there.
One thing that is coming to my mind during our conversation now, we talk about group sessions, and we never touched now the number of the players in the group and how it affects the effectiveness and what you can do. I did group sessions from, I would call it from pairs. It's already a group, but up to the 8 players on 2 courts. So obviously the different number of players, different number of courts will also set up also different opportunities for the coach. If you have 8 players, probably you will not be really able to play with one of them individually during 2 hours. So we have to be more like a manager. Perhaps in one part you can do 2 of them and so on, a little bit on one court. But when we talk about the young players and development in a group, I would like also to share with you my opinion, but also hear your feedback. I found out that actually the group of 3 is really, for me, the best group. Because then, of course, if you want to have also the technical part, it's easy. Because you have 1 with 2, and 2 have a task, very simple organization. But also you can play a lot of points where one guy will play 2 points and they change. So they have a lot of repetitions. It's a good rhythm. And I would say that number of 3 is something what I would really recommend as a group, quality group practice. So typically it's 4 on court, yeah? That's like a typical group. But I would also suggest to the people to think about these different numbers. Obviously, add number like 5. It's challenging for organization, but you can do a lot of great double drills with 5 players.
Well, that links to your point.
That's a good thing to also share with our audience today.
Yeah, well, you had 3 questions to us earlier, and we only really tackled the third one. But I think you've tackled was it the first one or the second one, when you talk about half a court problem. Well, if you have 3 players and they work in threes, if only 2 players are rotating, and then there's always 1 on, 2 on, 1 off, then you do get the full court experience. So I understand that 3 is a great number. Of course, Savoy, some coaches will be listeners going, well, we can't make it profitable if it's 3 players, we have to have 4 players, otherwise it becomes too expensive. And look, that's fair enough. That's a fair rebuttal of that point. But I know what you're saying. In an ideal situation, 3 is a great number because people get rest from the coaches talking, but they get enough individualized attention because it's 33, 33, 33 in order to help improve their skills. And it's a nice example.
One more thing to that. Our most successful coach in the Netherlands, he produced like 3 top 25 players in the world. So they came out of his academy. This guy normally worked on 3 or 4 courts with 4 players per court. And it's interesting to think he didn't differentiate that much, but they had a very high standard of working hard.
Yeah.
And he would always oversee the whole group, so that when he was walking around at court number 3, he would shout your name while you would be on court number 1 because you didn't do this or you did do that, and to give feedback on something. And that is like a skill where you have to oversee the court and give feedback. Your voice has to be strong enough to do that. But this guy has been really coaching a lot of good players in the Netherlands. So it was never about, small group on one court to give a lot of attention. No, many players on the court. Yeah. And for this, I would like to also differentiate between the attention that you get is actually more depending on your skill to oversee 3 courts. And also the other thing is it's about the discipline, high discipline working. So when they got feedback, it was very often because they didn't work hard enough in his point of view. Yeah. So there's difference between the content you deliver, like specific corrections or specific goal setting, and the working attitude, the professional attitude to become a better player. And all his players were for sure having this professional attitude to work. They would never just walk around and being without energy, because he wouldn't accept that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think of the, let's say, the high discipline approach, and on the other side, the contents of it. And when they meet each other, then the group size is actually not the issue.
No, I think, but sorry, this links beautifully back to Voye's second point, which was, Simon, answer the Eastern European parents that the players that aren't good enough for my son or daughter. Therefore, we need an individual coach who can play with my son and raise the level. That is something I hear a lot from parents as I travel the world. But what you're saying there, Frank, is if you've got lots of players over 2, 3, 4 courts, because there might be one player that's the best, but they shouldn't. If they're a long way from being at the same level as the other players, there are still things you can do, right? You can have 2 against 1, and that makes, because those
Absolutely.
two can be weaker and that player can be stronger. But then Andy Murray would do that in the National Tennis Centre. He was #1 in the world. He would be practicing in the National Tennis Centre. I'd have my lunch, come down and watch. There was no one good enough for him to play with. So what did he do? He put 2 coaches of a lower level, 2 players of a lower level in the corners, and then it simulated a bit more of the.
Sure.
Can maintain the rally for longer because they didn't have to cover as much court. So that's how you solve that problem. The other thing I would say is there may be a valid. Okay, I would say to those parents, Voye, yeah, your son's the best player in the group, but there's still things he can do to get better, and we'll arrange the session to ensure that he still gets good hits, and we'll make it harder. He can only hit into 1 half, they can hit to 2 halves, things like that, which are easy to organize. Or maybe we need another level of squad. It's not like you need to give up group coaching and just have private lessons. That's not the solution. Maybe the solution is go to another academy, which will offer your son or daughter a similar level of hitting and stretch them up even more. That's what happens in the world. Murray leaves Scotland, he goes to Sanchez Cascal, then he leaves there, goes to the National Tennis Centre. So players are moving all the time to get a better hitting environment. That's the tennis world. That's normal. I don't say you have to, I'll just say it's an option. But the first option is not, well, my son's too good for that squad. Let's pull him out of all the squads and just have private lessons. That's like, no, travel a bit further and find a squad that will give your son or daughter a good playing level.
Yeah, I believe we all agree that the group setting is very important for developing young players. Very important. And now, guys, another topic for you to hear from you a little bit as an expert, because we know the differences between the girls and boys. The boys loves to be in the groups. They love to compete in the groups. And from the age of 12, 13, the girls are starting to be more, how to say, more oriented to hitting practices, and it's more difficult to make them together to play practice points and matches against each other. What are your experiences in this area, in the group settings with the girls or mixed groups and so on? Perhaps Frank is smiling, so I'm sure he has another magic.
No magic. But in the years ago when we had the district system, I remember the coach who was right in the middle of the country. He always had the players, boys and girls, together, and they all worked with each other and were sparring with each other. It was especially effective under 14. And then when you see those physical differences coming, where the boys are really hitting harder, hitting too fast serves or whatever, there you could see that there were more problems. But he actually, this coach really taught them to see playing points as an evaluation of your training. So he made sure that in the training, the feedback he gave was also the feedback he would use, apart from whether they lost or won the points, but giving feedback related to what he had seen in the training. So you can educate the girls also to be less vulnerable for winning and losing in a practice situation. And I agree that a lot of girls are very concerned about that. They don't want to lose. They prefer the private coach because then there's no danger. But at the end, they all have to play. And when they lose in a tournament, they will also have trouble in getting over a loss. So we have to help them to get over there, to have the focus on their game and not too much on the result.
But do you agree with this? It's not a scientifically proven, but from my experience, I would say that mixing boys and girls between the age of 11 and 14 is actually the right thing for one and the other gender, because the girls are bringing, I would say, more seriousness to practice to the boys, but also the boys are bringing this, I would say, enjoyment in playing points. And for the girls,
Yeah.
it's not so much easier. That was my experience, especially 12, 13. That was so good when there was a mixed group, better than 4 boys or 4 girls. It was a really better environment for me and for the players. So, Simon, what is your actually experience with this to hear that?
Well, you know, part of me wants to say they should all just play together and have fun and benefit from each other. And that's why that's how it should work. Keep everyone together. But the reality is, Voye, there are single-sex schools. You know, there are boys' schools and girls' schools, and the results academically seem to be mixed. But okay, mixed schools can have good results. Single-sex schools can have good results. So I recently had Alistair Filmer, who was the coach of Emma Raducanu between the ages of 10 and 14. She had a very individualized program. It was very much coach doing a lot of the hitting and coaching. She wasn't accessing lots of squads on a weekly basis. I mean, I'd have to check the details again a little bit on all 10 to 14 years, but that's pretty much, and a lot of people, a lot of the girls tend to follow that route, very individualized, professional, focused program. What's funny about that, of course, in some senses, is it because there are no other girls in your geographical area for you to hit with at that level? You know, there's less girls than boys often in tennis, and maybe in Eastern European it's a bit different, but certainly in the UK, the stats are clear. It's 4-1, I think, or 3-1 boys playing tennis to girls. So the pool is smaller. So the girls have to hit in with the boys, and then it's 2 girls and 6 boys. So it's a power balance, perhaps. But the other thing I would say is, it also is the same on the tour. Huh? Like on the tour, you go to US Open practice courts and the girls are practicing with their male hitting partner coach. That's not a stereotype. That's a general trend. What's funny about it, though, is that when they go to Fed Cup or Billie Jean King Cup, and it's the females are in a team, they will hit with each other. They will hit with each other. If in the days leading up to a Fed Cup match, they will practice. But on the tour, they're less likely to hit with each other. They would prefer to choose their hitting, maybe because they're paying them and therefore they feel they need to do something, or they get the same ball, or there's that fear of the perception of losing and winning in practice and what that will do psychologically. I think that's a great point Frank made. But I do think there's an education piece here around helping the females understand the value of them practicing with each other a lot more, and not just having to have a male hitting coach or an older female hitting coach. So yeah, to answer your question, Voye, I think it's I think both can work. The reality is both are possible. It very much depends on your individual context. Perhaps you're in the Czech Republic at Sparta Prague, a tennis academy, and there are 10 girls, because they're so good, the Czech girls, there's 10 of them, and they will hit with each other every day. Because the sheer number of them, they have to. They've got enough courts to have 10 coaches, 10 players. So they have to play with each other. But then in the UK, or if you're in Ireland and there's not so many girls your level, maybe you need a good hitting coach that's going to push your level up. I think context is very important in this situation.
Yeah, I believe there's one more thing we didn't really address yet. When there's a private session, the coach with his feeding can make a player look great.
Yeah.
And in a group session, when it's kind of homogeneous group, so they're about the same level, they will get the shots the way they get them in a match, because that's the level they play at.
Yeah.
Very often I see coaches feeding balls to a pretty good player, but it's like almost neutral, just to, well, make them feel good. They get some confidence on a low level, and then they're surprised that it doesn't work out that well in the match. So the feeding should actually also be on the level of the player. And then one of the things I decided not to do, like years ago with some of the national top juniors, is to play them, because I have this old-fashioned slice backhand, and it drove them crazy. But it was also the kind of slice backhand they would never get. My slice backhand was much better than the weak slice backhands they played in, or they saw in defensive situations from the other side. So I would need a much faster shot and more pressure with my backhand, actually a little bit spin on it, which was not my bread and butter shot at all. So when you have two players of about the same level, you automatically get the level they play on in a match. So the feeding of this individual coach has to resemble what they're going to play. And the fact that the coach has been a very good player, but years ago when they played a different game, is probably not the feeding they need to become a better player. So I would like to add this to our conversation as probably a closing point, because I think it's also important for those people who think that the individual session is always better than the group session.
Just to follow up on what you just said, and from my side to clarify a little bit, I feel that yes, if you are having individual lesson, or even in a group setting, if I play with my player, of course I can use, I would call it set up the balls if I want to change some technique. Obviously that's advantage because the player will get a consistently easy balls, let's say like this, that he can practice something new or to correct. But one thing that coaches very often forget is pushing the borders. And pushing the border, because then I have then as a coach possibility to actually play 10% better than what you need. And that's very often what coaches don't use, because this is what is really also advantage in this setup with the coach, but then push the border, not give him a setup ball. It's pushing the border so that you are getting better. And this is from my side at the end. And Simon, perhaps you can close it up.
I think we've raised some really interesting questions for both coaches and parents that are curious about this topic, about investing in group versus individual sessions. And I think probably the summary we would all agree on is that both are important for the development of your child's tennis. Both are absolute net good, 100% net good value for your child. The individual lessons are important because they allow you to have a connection with your coach at a deeper level. You can focus 100% on the athlete. You can work on their skills completely individually, and that's an important part of a player's development. And that has probably been a trend of all top players that have had some success in the game. They've had individual attention from good coaches from a young age. So we're not saying groups are the only way to go. We're not saying individuals are the only way to go. Both, we think, a balanced hybrid of the two at some stage in your development are essential ingredients to your player reaching their potential, and more importantly, having a great experience of tennis, an organic one. I thought that last point you made, Frank, about it being, organic and it's more realistic to the game is a really important point. Then the coach always making the ball go in the same spot for your player. But the movement needed and the dealing with junk balls and high loopy balls and slices at your feet in the wind, that's the reality of our sport. And that's what makes it so much fun. So for me, major message is maximize great coaches in both environments for your child to maximize their tennis, I think is the key message there. Both have huge benefits. That's my signing off point. Do you two want to mention anything just to leave the audience with?
Okay, I will say just a sentence and leave to Frank the last word.
No extra message from my side. I think it was a spontaneous conversation where we just added more and more and more. And I think it's a good overview of all the possibilities. So thank you guys for this.
Thank you. Avoye?
All the best to everybody and enjoy your practices in groups and individual settings.
Exactly, yeah. We look forward to seeing you for our next Coaching Conversations webinar. Thanks, everyone, and have a great week.
Bye-bye.